Hello and welcome to Understanding Cyber with me, Tom, and Matt. Say hello, Matt.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Excellent stuff. The astute among you will have noticed that Toby's not here today. He's off doing other things for this episode, but he will be back later in this series. But for this topic, which we're going to mention in just a moment, he's actually given way to Matt. So Matt, to introduce him, is a principal cybersecurity consultant here at our company, Clearcut Cyber. He's also a risk specialist. So Matt's got experience of risk management across a huge range of disciplines, sectors and scenarios, from the kind of classical operational risk in the physical domain through to managing much more complex cyber risks in situations where it's fair to say that failure to manage those properly could be pretty catastrophic. So given his experience, given his qualification, we thought we'd bring Matt in to talk about our topic today, which is, spoiler alert, risk. This is the first in a series of 4 podcasts specifically around risk, with others to follow. So look out for them as they come. And before you switch off, we're going to treat risk differently from what you've heard before, from what you've seen before. Bear with us. We're going to give you some novel, creative ideas of how to think about and how to manage risk that hopefully you won't have encountered. So a bit of variety for what you hear. Matt has some interesting and potentially controversial views on risk, which will hopefully draw out some thinking with you. In previous episodes, such as episode 30, which we called Function to Fortification, I think it was originally called What's Important, we spoke about how to decide or figure out which IT services, devices, platforms, and so on are important to a business or an organization. And we discussed that the kind of cybersecurity actions you take would be based on the level of exposure or risk. And we quietly moved on and didn't really explain ourselves. So we're going to come back and explain what this exposure or risk really means, and why we think lots of organizations get it wrong. So Matt, start with the controversial things then. What do you think about risk that's different? How do you think differently about risk?
Well, so thanks so much. I mean, lots of people know the theory about risk, but I would argue that a lot of people get it wrong. They overcomplicate it, or they just apply it in ways that are frankly unhelpful. So how I'd suggest we break it down today is to look at 3 things: what risk management in cybersecurity actually is, where people get it wrong, and then give some advice on how to get it right.
That sounds good. Okay, let's start then with what is risk management, and I'm gonna start this. So I've been a consultant for a while, about 8-10 years. I'm even an NCSC certified cyber professional in the risk specialization. Don't you know? It doesn't get me upgraded on airlines, but never mind, I suppose. And whenever I think of risk, I think, oh no. And then I remember that it's not all that bad. I think there's this risk has a bad reputation, and it's completely undeserved, not least because risk is everywhere in your life, and certainly in business and cyber. So I think of the classic, the ISO definition, the impact of uncertainty on objectives, which only makes sense when you read it backwards in the mirror. Impact, likelihood comes to mind, identify, analyze, evaluate, then manage and monitor, component approaches, systems approaches. There's loads of ways of viewing risk, but they require a bit of examination and consideration. They're not necessarily very intuitive, and it doesn't really tell us much about risk management. They're just lists of stuff. So probably worth asking, what do we actually mean by risk then?
Yeah, it's always dangerous admitting to being a risk specialist or something like that. It certainly gets the topic away from you at a party.
Yeah. Well, we'll move on.
Yeah, it's not that interesting to the general public. But boiling it down to the basics, a risk is really just an event that you don't want it to happen. You want to be able to identify these events in advance and then do something about them, so that either they happen less often, they don't happen at all, or when they do happen, things aren't as bad as they could have been. I mean, and that is really, in its simplest definition, what risk is.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's so important to make it intuitive to people, because it isn't that hard actually. And there are, I know we've made some simplifications there, and some people may disagree with elements of it, but fundamentally, I completely agree. That really is all it's about, and it manifests, as we've mentioned before, all over the place. So people should be familiar with this kind of thing. So this series then is really going to be thinking about futures, things that you don't want to happen, and we're going to cover some of those concepts in more detail, especially futures, in one of the next episodes. So that was kind of thing number 1 we said to discuss. I guess the next thing then is where does everybody go wrong? There's loads of stuff out there. There's loads of frameworks and lots of processes, lots of reading. There are plenty of people who want to sell you stuff that will help you do risk better. People have qualifications and experience in this that we already mentioned, which may or may not get you upgraded on planes. What are we claiming that people do wrong generally?
So the first thing I'd really highlight is checklists. So someone intelligent comes up with one of these processes, one of these frameworks, and to share it, they make it into a flowchart or a spreadsheet to make it easier to understand. And then someone who understands the process less than the intelligent person who came up with it takes it and then blindly follows it. And this can mean that people focus on the process or a false goal rather than thinking, what is this aiming to achieve? And the aim could shift from ensuring robust risk management to making sure that there are as many green boxes on your process or checklist, or you've got the highest score that you possibly can, rather than thinking about the underlying issues.
That's completely true. I think this is not to say, I think we should stress, it's not to say that checklists don't have their place. I think we'd all agree they do, but they're not always the right answer. And people often reach for them, as you say, because they're kind of simple and straightforward. But if you're packing to go on holiday, a checklist is a good thing. It's simple, effective, reliable, not likely to go wrong. In cybersecurity, checking a box is often not really enough. Hackers do not care about your list of checks, right? They don't care. Right? There's more to life than checklists. So yeah, there's a place, but no, that's fine. Okay, what other things have we got?
Absolutely. And I think sort of moving on from that and links to it is that you might carry out this risk assessment and the controls that follow on from it without thinking about any of the wider implications. And the really safest systems or processes would have loads of controls. They'd have checks, balances, the best encryption that money could buy, and everything else. The problem with this is that no one could use it. It would become so fiendishly difficult to use or unwieldy or anything like that, that eventually no one would be able to use it as a system. And people want things to be as easy as possible. And a system that might be required for the company to operate sort of needs to have that balance. And if there isn't the right balance, things start going wrong. And what do people tend to do if you've got some ridiculous control imposed on you?
They tend to ignore it. Or not that I would ever do that, of course. Or they find a less secure way around it. So the antivirus keeps going off. You just turn off the antivirus.
Absolutely. The other really common one that people complain about is overly complex password requirements that change every couple of weeks. And actually what that encourages is worse behaviors at the end of it. Suddenly everyone just puts an exclamation mark at the end of their password because they need a special character. They increment the number that they put on the end of the password by 1, and they use a simple dictionary word because they've got no other way of remembering.
Exactly. I think a lot of people out there feeling very seen right now.
Yeah. Password 01 exclamation mark is a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, that's not good.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. So yeah, implementing things that are overly onerous and people are likely to kind of bypass or circumvent. What else can we look at that people get wrong?
I suppose the next one is really identifying these risks and then doing nothing about it. And this is a really, really common thing that we see. And this is the sort of, it's all a bit difficult problem. And we really find it when the person identifying the risks or given the problem is not empowered to do anything about it, or they'll be told they're just getting in the way of things. So you always get that balance between operational needs and keeping the risk as low as possible.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen this with some of our customers, or even in previous jobs as well, where stuff ends up on a risk register and someone says, we've identified the risk and we've written it down, therefore we've done due diligence. And they kind of shrug and say, well, I can't do anything about it anyway. And that's it. Yeah. Back to my comment earlier, hackers, cyber threat actors don't care about your risk register, right? You need to do something with your risk.
Absolutely.
Them.
Yeah, when it all goes wrong, sort of being able to say, we saw that coming, it was on the risk register, isn't much of a help. It still happened.
If anything, it's even more embarrassing. We knew about it and did
Absolutely. Yeah. We saw it coming. It's sort of watching a car come flying towards you at high speed, having the time to move out the way and just saying, I've noticed that car.
I like it. That's so true. What about what next? What about when it comes to sort of managing risk, looking at dealing with it, whatever?
Yeah, and again, this is linked to the previous point that you can identify these things, but then sometimes people refuse to accept that there is a risk, and so people have a disconnect between the ambition and fundamentally the size of their checkbook. It also sounds quite bad to say we're just going to have to accept this. It's not a good thing for an organization to say. But the problem is, and there's a great quote by a guy called Gene Spafford, who said, the only system which is truly secure is one which is switched off and unplugged, locked in a titanium-lined safe, buried in a concrete bunker, and is surrounded by nerve gas and very highly paid armed guards. Even then, I wouldn't stake my life on it.
It sounds expensive. So what does this mean in practical terms then?
Well, it means you're either going to get paralyzed by risk controls, or you're going to end up lying to your senior management who think everything is fine and that their zero cyber risk approach is working fine right up until the day that it all goes wrong and the ICO come a knocking because you've just lost everybody's data.
Yes, not a good day indeed.
Not a good day. And so balancing that sort of understanding of you are going to have to accept some sort of residual level of risk. There is no such thing as zero risk.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's funny when we teach some of our students, we talk about risk appetite and how that's communicated down. And there are industries where people talk about or they aspire to have zero risk, but they absolutely acknowledge that that's not a thing. And the more organizations that recognize that, the better. So, think about transport industry, aviation, or the railways, whatever. They will say we have zero tolerance for loss of life or risk of harm to our passengers. Fine, that's great. And so they should, but they accept the reality that actually it's going to be as low as reasonably possible or something. There's always going to be an acceptance of some non-zero risk. Yeah. What about overarching processes, that kind of stuff? Where does that kind of come in?
Yeah. So these processes are well written and are sensible and have been thought through. And the danger actually comes when people apply them incorrectly or don't use any independent thought. This is a bit sort of the Chinese whispers idea that they've been designed using decent rigor, lots of experience. They're then taught to a greater or lesser degree of quality. Then they get taught again and again and again, and this knowledge gets diluted. And eventually someone says something that isn't true. But because they're teaching it, you might have paid to attend this course, or they might have a qualification, you believe it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of myths and misconceptions out there that, as you say, are based on just kind of passed on inherited knowledge that everyone assumes to be the case. I think a really good one we see quite a lot is the NIST cybersecurity framework, where people, even entire organizations, approach the sort of the 5 functions sequentially and say, no, we'll do identify first, then we'll do some protect, and then we do detect or whatever. And the document explicitly says, don't do that. You can plan that way, but you don't do it in execution. But no one cares because they've all been told, they've all heard, we do a bit of this, then a bit of that, whatever, in order. And we see it with things like, in terms of, implementing things incorrectly. You ask an organization, have you enforced MFA? And they say, yeah, we've enabled it on all accounts. And you say, that's not quite the question I asked. Yeah. Have you enforced it? So just because you have the option to use it, are people told they have to, is technically, are they forced to use it? Or they'll stick in, amazing logging and detection mechanisms, but they don't actually check the logs or turn on the detection mechanism. So that nothing actually happens. It's a clever thing in some senses. It's also absolutely stupid. So less than ideal.
Yeah. So, those are really my thoughts on how people get it wrong. So that you might get people using checklists blindly, not thinking about the wider implications on the business or the organization, identifying risk, and then assuming because you've identified it, that's the problem solved. You don't have to do anything more. Not accepting risk, or even believing that you've got to reduce all your risks to zero, or blindly applying these processes and tools. But what I'm not saying is that if you've fallen into one of these traps, then all bets are off, and that risk assessment was a waste of time. Doing your risk assessment like a checklist is still better than not doing it at all, which is a really important thing like this, that just because your process isn't perfect or what you're doing isn't perfect doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. What we're trying to do here is save an awful lot of effort by doing these things properly.
And that's really important, isn't it, about the saving effort? Yeah, people are applying effort to these things already. They can do it in a more efficient and structured and ultimately intelligent way that frees up capacity to do other things or to do those things better. I guess that's what it's all about, isn't it? Not saying categorically everyone is wrong, but
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Let's be careful. Okay, so the third thing we said we talk about then is the right way to go about it. So I'm completely sold on everything you told me, and I know this from experience too, that very often people get risk wrong. We've been somewhat rude about other people and in general and what's going on in the world. All very well and good slinging mud and saying everybody's wrong, but we're professionals, we're positive, we're optimistic. There's an opportunity to improve here. What can we do? How can we go about improving the way people do risk?
Well, shock horror, the NCSC have some really good guidance. They've got we've got to make it very clear we're not in the pay of the NCSC here. I think
Is it true? No, we're not. No.
But they've got a framework.
I think they'd hasten to add that as well, actually. Yeah.
They've got a framework just like everyone else, but the context around it and some of the wrap around it is excellent.
Yeah, we base a lot of our approach on the NCSC because they're, again, a promise. Like I said, we're not being paid by them, and I'm sure they'd want to distance themselves too. But how the NCSC set things out, they have a lot of really, really good guidance out there, and we've applied it in many, many different ways across different sectors and so on. So a lot of experience of doing it. So Matt, thinking about that then, how can people use that kind of guidance to do risk better?
So the first point or bit of advice I'd give is to use tools intelligently. So there's loads and loads of tools out there which they systemize your common sense. So they can be a real help to you in all stages of your risk management process. But more importantly, they're a guide and they can be adapted. And not every single tool or every single process will be appropriate for every situation. So that's why I'd always say to use them intelligently. The best thing we've got at our at our disposal as professionals in this area is our wide range of tools, experience that we can use in any situation, and our willingness to try new things. These tools don't give you any extra knowledge. They don't suddenly unlock some secrets that you never had before. All they're doing is helping structure your thinking in a way that provides more sensible or potentially more creative or a little bit more rigor to your answers or your
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of tools and templates, that kind of thing. It's not least because it saves you making stuff up. So it saves you effort for a start. And also what you're then using is something which is tried and tested and ratified, provided you've got it from a good source like the NCSC. Yeah, it keeps your thinking on track. You can use them. It makes reporting easy and communicating easy, because sometimes you can fill in one of these templates or tools and literally just hand it to someone else and say, here's where I've got to, and communicate where you're at. Loads of really good guidance and methods also for checking up on how you're getting on. And as you say, like, I think sometimes people get overwhelmed by the number of tools out there. That's totally reasonable and totally fair. It does require a bit of research or a bit of expertise to help you, but they are good ones, are flexible and adaptable. And I would love to see a situation in a cybersecurity problem where there is not already a half decent tool that you can pick up and use. It's unlikely that someone hasn't got something out there for you. So the solution is probably there somewhere, is what I'm saying. It's just a case of knowing where to look and where to go. And certainly our next episode is going to look at how you can use tools to sort of better identify risk, for example. So have a listen to that. Cool. What else can we do to do things better then?
I think the next point, and it links back to that not understanding the wider context of how people get things wrong, is understanding the relationship and the balance between organizational needs and security needs. So it's about considering the risk in the wider context. You can't just walk into an organization, speak to the IT department about minimizing the risk, implement all the controls, and then walk out to get problem solved. I've done it. There might be a really, really good operational reason why some of the servers are still running Windows Server 2003. And if you turn around and say everything must be upgraded to exactly the latest version, and I'm not going to hear any arguments against it, people might not thank you for breaking everything because you've minimized the risk.
Absolutely. And we see this a lot. And I think if I recall, you've got, I was going to say great, perhaps not so great because it's a bit sad, but a strong example of this kind of thing happening.
Yeah. We saw this example in a school which suffered a cyber attack. And what happened was they'd given all their teachers local admin rights. Now, on the face of that seems insane. I mean, you wouldn't advocate that in any organization, would you?
Absolutely not.
No. But the problem was the way things were set up with some new remote whiteboard software. This is, peak COVID, everything's being rolled out very quickly. They're trying to make sure that everything can still happen and pupils can still learn, which is the core role of this organization. It's a school. But this was some new remote whiteboard software. And without being a local admin, the teachers couldn't actually do their job. It couldn't work. Sorry.
That's really a classic example of the two extremes of like thing you absolutely must not do from a risk perspective or management perspective is giving everybody admin rights, but equally without it they can't do any work at all. That's an awful situation to end up in.
And how do you solve that issue? You're given a wicked problem, and so you have to understand the full context of it. And conversely, it's all too easy to implement a security control which makes life really difficult for users or which makes day-to-day functions prohibitively difficult. So think about hard drive encryption with BitLocker. Everyone has to remember a short but complex password to access their device. Okay, so it's got to be a random series of letters and numbers because that's what your corporation policy says you have to have. No one can remember any of this random series of letters and numbers, and you've got to type it in every single time you unlock your laptop. And you can't work it out. You can't work at all if you don't know it. So what does everyone do?
Naturally, you write it down, tape it to the underneath the laptop. Presumably.
That's what, and we see it. There's been examples of ministers from, I think it was the Latvian government. A Latvian government minister posted a photo of her laptop.
I remember this.
And taped to the front of it. This was on Instagram. Taped to the front of it was her BitLocker password. Which, and it's just a natural thing that people do because they are getting around these things.
It's human nature. Yeah.
It's human nature. Most people are not technically minded, especially among older generations of people who didn't grow up with smartphones and tablets and all of this.
And this is very true too. I mean, we laugh and people make mistakes. That's totally understandable. But in some instances, it's completely reasonable, or rather, actually, I should say, it's not entirely reasonable to expect people to be familiar with these technologies, as you say, and to placing any kind of onus or responsibility on users for security is a delicate matter, I think. And we've seen this a lot in the charity sector. Charities naturally rely on volunteers for support. But it can be really hard to get people in certain demographics within the volunteer community, who tend to be potentially retired or slightly older, to follow cybersecurity practices. For example, multi-factor authentication. My father is in his 70s. He's pretty technically savvy. He's been working around technology most of his life, but he struggles with some basic sort of cybersecurity things like MFA. And this creates a real challenge for the cybersecurity teams in, for example, charities. How do you educate and upskill and support these people and enable them to do user-enabled security without scaring them off? You don't want to overwhelm the volunteers because you rely on them. And we sometimes call this, thinking about second-order effects. We've seen examples of people who've taken risk decisions. On the face of it, they look absolutely crazy, but when you explain the context, you see why this has happened, and you see why the logic behind the decision. Like you say, your Server 2003, there may be a very good reason why you've done that. And I just a little bone of contention I'm going to throw in here is that I think Cyber Essentials is great, but one of the things that's particularly difficult for charities is managing Cyber Essentials against the volunteer community, because there's quite a lot of onus on people who potentially aren't particularly cybersecurity savvy. So anyway, sorry, I'll take my oar out.
That's all right, Nick. You've made your point. I'm sure I hope the Cyber Essentials people are listening.
Professor, give us a shout. We'll provide you with some insight that might help improve things.
I mean, that sort of context really leads me onto my last point, which is actually the one I think people struggle with the most, is really to figure out what risk you can accept rather than how you can minimize every single risk. And we mentioned earlier that a zero risk approach isn't really a thing. We all take risks most of the time without even thinking about it. Every morning I stick myself in 1.5 tons of metal at speed which the human body is not really meant to withstand. And I surround myself with a load of other people all doing the same. Half of them on their phones, I think.
Yeah.
And I do that every day when I drive to work. And at some point, you'll have to accept a risk. And the question is actually what to do next. So this event that you've minimized every single risk might still happen. You get ransomware, data is stolen, something sensitive is leaked, and you did absolutely everything you could to stop it. You implemented every control you could. And that's when you get into the last part of the risk, is dealing with the aftermath of this event happening. It's planning for the worst day that your organization can have, and then making sure that your worst day gets better, and it gets better quickly. Yeah. And we'll cover that again in another one of the episodes, is really how do we deal with residual risk, is what it's sometimes called as well.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And before I let you summarize that section, I think that last point is a really important one. It's again, I know we keep saying we have customers, whatever, but we do encounter this a lot where people are really reluctant. And this is, again, is human nature, I suppose. They're really reluctant to consider the fact that these things may well happen, and actually that they should be all right with that. They should accept the fact that these things, may well be them one day in the limelight, or having a really awful day. But as you say, Matt, you can do things now that will make that awful day less awful. Preparations that aren't going to stop it happening, but are going to make it decidedly better than it would be otherwise. So we really encourage people to think about that. Cool. You talked through some great things there about how to do risk better. Could we just have a quick summary of those things before we move on?
Yeah, very quick summary then. It's the important things to remember how to do them well is use tools intelligently, treat them as tools, tweak them, accept their limitations and things like that. Balance your organization's need and the security needs, and think what is the optimum balance between those two. And finally, once you've done all of your risk management, figure out what risk you can accept and how you can accept it.
Excellent. Matt, thank you so much for your outline thoughts on risk. Really useful to understand where people kind of commonly make mistakes and approaches for doing it better. As we said at the beginning, this is an introductory episode. This is the first of a 4-part series. We'll introduce and discuss some tools and techniques to flesh out what Matt mentioned earlier on about using tools intelligently and for identifying risks, particularly in instances where you don't have a lot of reference data, which is a surprisingly common situation. But the key here is what we're going to provide are methods which are approachable and effective and do a much better job than just checklists or poorly implemented frameworks. So I'll hand over to Matt now with that in mind to do a summary or a quick reminder of everything he kind of spoke about just there.
I feel honoured being allowed to do the summary.
Excellent. No, good luck. I hope it goes well.
Thank you. So the first point, and if you take nothing else away from listening to this podcast, is that I'd say is that risk identification is not the same as risk management. We then start talking about where people go wrong. And these are things like using checklists blindly, not considering the wider implications on the business, which we talked about in our function to fortification episode, identifying risk and assuming that because you've identified it, then the problem's solved, not accepting any levels of risk, or blindly applying processes or tools. And then we spoke about the right way to do these things and our suggestions on how you would improve things. And so we said, use these tools intelligently, balance your organization's needs against its security needs, and then figure what risks you can accept and how to accept it.
Excellent. I was right to trust you with the summary.
Oh, that's a huge relief. I can sleep happy tonight.
Well played, sir. Well played. Excellent. Our final shameless sales pitch then, as an organization, ClearCut Cyber, risk in things like how to visualize risk, approach it, identify it, understand it, manage it, communicate it. It's something that's fully embedded and fundamental to what we do. We really do think about risk intelligently, about applying the right tooling, the right approach, and the right level of detail, depending on the specific organizational needs. If you want a conversation with us about this, you want some help or support, or even if you just want to argue with Matt about how he's wrong, we're happy to discuss this further. We'd love to hear from you. Get in touch, info@clearcutcyber.com. We'll go to our company's website at clearcutcyber.com. Before we sign off, Matt, any final thoughts or any comments from you, or are you happy with your first episode?
I'm very happy with my first episode. I look forward to the internet hive mind arguing with me about why I'm wrong. I look forward to the comments, and I'd gladly take some advice or anything else if people do have comments.
Excellent. No, constructive debate is always welcome. That's good stuff. In which case, then, we'll sign off for now from me, Tom, and
me, Matt.
We're all done. We'll catch you in the next episode. I look forward to speaking to you then. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.